Welcome to the Explainer. We have all been there, right? Tossing and turning all night, and then just stumbling through the next day in a total fog. But have you ever wondered what is actually going on inside our brains when we lose sleep? For a long time, science had a pretty neat story about this. Today, we're going to dive into that story, a very recent scientific plot twist, and the undisputed high cost of a sleepless night. It's such a universal feeling, isn't it? That sense that your thinking is just slower. Your focus is shot, your memory isn't working right. We know we feel different, but the big question is why? And it all comes down to how sleep, or a lack of it, really messes with our cognitive function. Okay, so let's get on the same page here. When we say cognitive function, we're not talking about just one thing. We're talking about the whole toolkit, the entire suite of mental processes. It's your attention, your memory, your ability to solve problems, your judgment. It's basically the command center that lets you navigate the world. And as you're about to see, sleep is the absolutely critical maintenance period for this entire system. So for our first part, let's look at one of the most powerful ideas to come out of neuroscience in the last decade or so, this idea that sleep is basically the brain's personal cleaning crew. So the theory goes kind of like this. All day long, as our brain cells are firing away, thinking and working hard, they're producing metabolic waste. You can think of it like the exhaust fumes from a busy city. So the idea was that sleep gives the brain this crucial downtime to flush out all these potentially toxic byproducts, like beta-amyloid proteins. You've probably heard of those. They're famously linked to Alzheimer's disease. And this quote right here, it just nails the core of the theory. Researchers at Washington University figured out that our neurons, the very cells that do the thinking, aren't just sending signals, they're also acting as tiny miniature pumps. The idea is that during deep sleep, these neurons fire together in these big, rhythmic waves, creating a current that literally washes the brain clean. And this whole process has a name, the glymphatic system. It was thought to be a huge reason why we even need to sleep. So as you can see here, cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, would flow into the brain. It gets pushed along by those big, slow brainwaves of deep sleep. It mixes with the fluid in between the cells, collecting all the gunk, and then, boom, it flushes all that contaminated fluid out. It's just a really elegant and powerful explanation for why sleep feels so restorative. So yeah, it was a theory that made perfect sense. It was clean, it was tidy, but you know how it goes in science. The story rarely just ends there. And in this case, it was about to take a massive plot twist. This idea of the brain's nightly detox became the dominant view. It was everywhere. In articles, lectures, it just seemed to explain so perfectly why a lack of sleep feels so, toxic. But science isn't about finding a good story and sticking with it. It's about testing that story over and over and over again. And then, in early 2024, this happened. Headlines like this one started popping up. A new study, this time from researchers at Imperial College London, came out and challenged the very foundation of that glymphatic theory. It sent a huge ripple through the world of sleep science. Okay, so this slide gets to the heart of it. On the left, you have the prevailing theory that waste clearance ramps way up during sleep by as much as 90%. But the new study, where they used a special dye to actually watch fluid move around in the brains of mice, found the exact opposite. Clearance actually decreased by about 30% when the mice were asleep and by 50% when they were under anesthesia, compared to when they were awake and active. And this whole debate is a perfect example of how science actually works. It's this living, breathing process of discovery. Now, this does not mean sleep isn't important. In fact, one of the study's authors even suggested that just being awake and maybe even exercising could be more efficient at cleaning the brain. But regardless of the mechanism, whether it's waste clearance or something else entirely, there is absolutely zero debate about the devastating impact of sleep loss on our ability to think. So, that brings us to the core of this whole thing, the undeniable, evidence-based consequences of sleep deprivation. What really happens when we don't get the rest our brains are screaming for? Let's start with a number, 78%. Just let that sink in for a second. According to a massive study on adolescent brain development, nearly 4 out of every 5 U.S. high school students get less than the recommended amount of sleep. This isn't just a handful of tired kids we're talking about. It's a massive population operating at a cognitive deficit during what is arguably the most critical period of their brain's growth. And the reasons for this sleep deficit are all over the map. It's not just about pulling an all-nighter for an exam. The cognitive problems we see come from a whole range of issues, from just chronic sleep restriction and insomnia to serious conditions like sleep apnea, where your breathing literally stops and starts all night long, just shattering your sleep quality. Now, what's really fascinating when you look at the data is that not all sleep loss is created equal. This table shows how different disorders can target really specific brain functions. So, for example, simple sleep deprivation just hammers your attention. Insomnia seems to go after things like your memory for events and your problem-solving skills. And then you have something like sleep apnea, which can cause these widespread issues, hitting everything from language to high-level decision-making. So why is the impact so incredibly broad? Well, this slide gives us a huge clue. Take a look at the top images. The areas in blue are involved in both sleep and depression. Now look at the bottom ones. The orange areas are involved in both sleep and our thinking skills. Do you see that incredible overlap? We're talking about the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe. The exact same brain machinery is pulling double duty. This shows you, clear as day, why you can't mess with sleep without profoundly affecting both our mood and our ability to think clearly. All right, let's bring this all home. With all this evidence in front of us, what are the most critical reasons your brain absolutely, positively must have sleep to stay healthy and functional for the long haul? Let's not beat around the bush. One of the biggest long-term risks is dementia. Multiple studies have found that people with sleep problems have a much higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. In fact, some research has shown that even a single night of sleep deprivation can increase the levels of beta amyloid in the brain, and that's the very protein that clumps together to form those infamous plaques in Alzheimer's patients. If we zoom in to the microscopic level, sleep loss is basically waging a war on your memory formation. Deep inside the hippocampus, which is the brain's memory hub, a lack of sleep completely disrupts these critical signaling pathways. It's like having static on the line between your brain cells, and that interference prevents the chemical signals needed to turn a fragile, short-term memory into a stable, long-term one. Your brain literally loses its ability to save the day's experiences. And let's just circle right back to that 78% of high schoolers. The teenage brain is going through this massive, once-in-a-lifetime period of development and reorganization, and that makes it uniquely vulnerable to the effects of sleep loss. So chronic sleep deprivation during these teen years doesn't just hurt grades. It can have lasting consequences on mental health, on decision-making, and on the very architecture of the brain as it's being built. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, while the scientific community keeps trying to unravel the exact how of sleep's magic, the what is crystal clear. Sleep is not passive downtime. It's an active, absolutely critical state for memory, for emotional regulation, and for lifelong brain health. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. We spend all our days learning, feeling, and experiencing the world, but is it possible that the most profound work our brain does to make sense of it all happens after we turn out the lights?